No one could understand why the reclusive millionaire left his entire fortune to a stranger, until they learned he had been searching for the cleaner's little girl for 25 years, all because of one thing she told him when she was only 5 years old. His name was Elias Thorne, a tech pioneer who vanished from public life. Hers was Maya, the 5-year-old daughter of the woman who cleaned his penthouse once a week. For a quarter of a century, that one sentence she spoke haunted him, secretly redirecting his entire empire's purpose. But what could a child possibly say to a man who had everything, and why did it take him 25 years to finally find her? To understand that, you need to see the gilded cage his life had become. The penthouse occupied the entire top floor of the Aurora Tower, a glass needle piercing the city skyline. Inside, the silence was a living thing, not peaceful, but pressurized. Elias Thorne moved through its 10,000 square feet like a curator in a museum of his own success. Every surface was polished marble or titanium, every artwork worth more than most houses, and every window offered a breathtaking view of a city he no longer engaged with. He had retreated here completely 3 years prior, after selling his data analytics company, Axiom, for a reported $850 million. The official reason was burnout. The truth was more complicated. His days followed a strict, self-imposed protocol. He woke at 5:15. He reviewed global markets for 1 hour. He trained with a private martial arts instructor at 7. His meals, prepared by a chef who left them in the climate-controlled pantry, were eaten alone at a 12-foot table. His human interactions were transactional and brief. His attorney, his financial manager, his head of security. He had not attended a social event in over 4 years. Friendships from his ascendant years had withered, perceiving his seclusion as arrogance. In many ways, it was a defense. The wealth that was supposed to be an endpoint felt increasingly like a cage. Studies on the psychology of the ultra-wealthy often note this isolation, a guilt for having so much, and a paralyzing fear of being loved only for the money, creating a loneliness that money itself cannot solve. On the other side of the city, in a neighborhood where the train noise was constant and the buildings wore layers of faded graffiti, Sofia Mendez woke up at 4:47. Her alarm was the buzz of an old phone on a crate beside a pull-out sofa. She had 7 minutes of quiet before her daughter, Maya, would stir. The apartment was a 2-room walk-up that smelled of the downstairs bakery and diesel fumes. Maya slept on the only real bed in the small bedroom. Sofia slept in the main room, which was also the kitchen and the living room. Her back always ached. She had been a cleaner for 12 years, since arriving from Guatemala at 19. She was, according to every agency she worked for, exceptional, thorough, discreet, and honest in an industry where trust was the real currency. Every Tuesday and Friday, she took 2 buses and a train to reach the Aurora Tower. The staff entrance was around the back, next to the loading docks. She would badge in, ride the service elevator, and enter the penthouse through the utility hall, a world away from the grand foyer. Her instructions were laminated, just like in the stories you hear. Do not interact with Mr. Thorne if he is present. Do not clean the study when the door is closed. Use only the provided, scent-free products. Focus on maintenance, not rearrangement. She was one of a rotating cast of service professionals, the chef, the trainer, the florist, who sustained the ecosystem of the penthouse without ever becoming part of it. For the first year, she barely saw him. Sometimes she heard the faint hum of the elevator that only he used, or saw the light from under the study door. They were satellites in the same orbit, never colliding. Maya, who was 4 when Sofia started the job, was usually at a subsidized daycare. But then the cuts came. First, the daycare raised its rates. Then, Sofia's second job, cleaning offices, scaled back her hours. The margin of error for her life, already razor-thin, disappeared. One Friday morning, her usual babysitter, her cousin, called in sick. Sofia had a choice: call out and risk losing her best-paying client, or figure it out. She figured it out. She brought Maya with her, a secret tucked into her old backpack with some crayons and an apple. She promised Maya they were going on a special adventure to a quiet castle in the sky. She would work fast, and Maya must be a mouse, silent and still in the small staff nook near the kitchen. Maya, a child with wide, observant eyes and a calm demeanor, nodded seriously. For 2 hours it worked. Sofia cleaned with one ear always tuned, her heart a drum in her chest. The penthouse was vast. She thought they were safe. But Elias Thorne had broken his own routine that day. A migraine, a product of insomnia and screen glare, had driven him from his study. He sought aspirin from the kitchen, a room he might visit once a month. He walked in and froze. There, at the enormous island of polished quartz, sat a small girl. She was coloring on the back of a discarded delivery memo. She looked up, not with fear, but with a quiet curiosity. Sophia, hearing the footsteps, appeared in the doorway, her face drained of all color. "Mr. Thorne, there was no one else. I am so sorry. It will not happen again." Her voice was tight with the fear of impending ruin. Elias said nothing. He just looked at the girl. He had not been this close to a child in decades. The last time might have been at a charity gala, a photo op. This was different, unscripted. Maya looked from her terrified mother to the tall, stern man. She didn't see a billionaire. She saw a man who looked tired, sad in a way that had nothing to do with the beautiful room. In that silent, charged moment, Sophia held her breath, waiting for the dismissal, the termination, the end of their fragile stability. And then Maya spoke. She didn't ask a question. She stated a fact, her voice clear and matter-of-fact in the cavernous kitchen. "You have a big, lonely house." That was it. 5 words. Sophia flinched as if struck, her hand flying to her mouth. The sentence hung in the air, a simple, devastating diagnosis from a 5-year-old physician who had never learned to lie. Elias Thorne did not get angry. He did not dismiss them. He stood very still, his migraine forgotten, looking from the child's earnest face to the mother's terrified one, and then at the vast, empty space around them. The silence stretched for 3 heartbeats, 4. Then he did something no one expected. He nodded just once. "Yes," he said, his own voice rough from disuse. "I suppose I do." He turned, walked to the pantry, retrieved the aspirin, and left the kitchen without another word. Sophia packed their things with trembling hands and left early, convinced the severance email would arrive by nightfall. It didn't. The following Tuesday, she returned alone, braced for termination. Instead, she found a small, new box of crayons and a coloring book on the staff nook counter. No note. The rules had not changed, but the atmosphere had. A pressure valve had been released. The next week, she saw him in the hallway. He was heading to the study, but paused. "Your daughter," he said, not looking at her directly. "She is well behaved." Sophia, stunned, managed a quiet, "Thank you, sir." He gave another brief nod. "If the childcare fails again, the nook is acceptable. Just ensure she does not touch the electronics." It was not warmth. It was a revision of protocol, a slight bending of the rules to account for a new, quietly acknowledged variable, basic human fallibility. This small allowance became a secret lifeline. Maya came perhaps once a month, always when emergencies arose. She would sit and draw, and sometimes Elias would appear. He never initiated conversation, but he began to pause to look at her drawings. One was of a tall, skinny stick figure next to a small one under a huge sun. "That's you and me," Maya said, pointing. "The sun is big, but it's far away, so it's not warm here." He had stared at that drawing for a long time before walking away. He didn't throw it out. Sophia found it later, neatly placed on the counter next to the crayon box. Then the gifts began, not for Sophia. For Maya, a book about planets, a high-quality set of watercolors, once a small, sophisticated telescope. She mentioned she liked the moon, was all he said when Sophia tried to stammer a protest. They were never extravagant toys, but they were thoughtful, hinting at a man who was actually listening. Research on the wealthy often shows this, a desire to be seen for their minds, not their money. In Maya, Elias found someone who did exactly that. She saw the lonely man, not the millionaire. And in her unvarnished observations, he found a strange, brutal form of truth he had been missing. A year passed this way. A quiet, unspoken rhythm developed in the penthouse. Sophia noticed changes, subtle but profound. The closed study door was now often open a crack. The towering, untouched shelves in the library began to show gaps where books had been pulled and not perfectly reshelved. One afternoon, she heard a sound that made her stop polishing the glass table, a low, rusty chuckle from the study, followed by Maya's giggle. She was showing him how to make a paper airplane. The plane, a clumsy thing, sailed out the door and landed at Sophia's feet. She picked it up, her eyes welling. The billionaire was learning to play from a 6-year-old. But this private thought inside the penthouse was creating a problem outside of it. Elias' seclusion had been a point of concern for the board of his charitable foundation, the Thorne Legacy Trust. The trust managed nearly $200 million, earmarked for tech education initiatives. For years, Elias had been a hands-off benefactor, approving proposals his managers put in front of him. Now he started asking questions, difficult ones. Why were they only funding elite university programs? What about the kids in the neighborhoods where his cleaners like Sophia lived? He requested new data, demographic breakdowns, impact studies on early childhood access. The board, led by his former attorney and longtime manager, Charles Whitlock, was unnerved. This was not the detached, efficient Elias they knew. This was emotional, messy, in the world of high-stakes philanthropy that looked like risk. Charles paid a visit to the penthouse. He found Elias not in the study, but in the library, a children's book about constellations open on the table beside his financial reports. Elias, Charles began, using the tone of a concerned parent. The board is talking. These new directives, they're erratic. We have a strategy, a proven one. Elias looked at him, and for the first time, Charles saw a defiance there. Proven to do what, Charles? Perpetuate the same cycle. We're just grooming the next generation of people like me. I'm not interested in that anymore. The conversation grew heated. Charles accused him of being influenced, of losing his strategic edge. He left with a thinly veiled threat. If Elias could not fulfill his fiduciary duties with clear-headed judgment, the board would have to discuss his removal as chairman. The pressure was mounting, and then the unthinkable happened. Sophia got sick, not a cold but pneumonia. She was hospitalized for a week. There was no work, no income. The medical bills began to pile up, a mountain of paper that dwarfed the one in her apartment. Maya stayed with the increasingly unreliable cousin. The fragile equilibrium of their lives shattered. From his sterile penthouse, Elias knew something was wrong. Sophia had missed 2 cleanings without a call, which was utterly unlike her. A rare moment of human concern led him to call the agency. They were vague, citing privacy, but he heard the words medical emergency. He did something impulsive. He sent a courier to the agency with an envelope containing $10,000 in cash and a note. For Sophia Mendez, no strings. It was an act of sheer, clumsy kindness, and it was a catastrophic mistake. The agency, bound by policies and suspicious of such a large, irregular cash transfer from a client, did not deliver the money. Instead, they called Charles Whitlock as the manager of Elias' domestic affairs. Charles saw not kindness but vulnerability, a breach. He descended on the penthouse, the envelope in hand. What is this, Elias? This is a liability nightmare. You cannot just give cash to staff. This is how you get sued for harassment, for undue influence. Elias, who had simply been trying to fix a problem, was cornered. In the face of Charles's legal and procedural onslaught, he capitulated. The money was returned to him. The agency was instructed to send a generic, get-well fruit basket to Sophia with a card from the company, not from him. Sophia came home from the hospital to the fruit basket and a stack of bills. The kindness of the crayons and the telescope felt like a cruel dream. The wall was back up, higher and thicker than before. She returned to work weaker, quieter. The easy silence was gone, replaced by a stiff, formal distance. Maya did not come again. The study door was once again firmly shut. Elias had tried to reach across the chasm, and the system he himself had built had slapped his hand away. He fell back into a deeper silence, a more profound isolation, haunted now by the memory of a connection he had failed to protect. 8 months later, Sophia sat Maya down. Her voice was steady, but her eyes were red. Mija, we have to move. I found a job in another city. It's better. The truth was, the medical debt was unsustainable. The cost of living was rising. The penthouse job, once a lifeline, now felt tainted by the humiliation of the returned charity. They needed a fresh start. They packed their few belongings into 3 suitcases. On their last day in the city, a rainy Thursday, Sophia took Maya to the Aurora Tower one final time to return the keycard to the front desk. She did not go up. As they stood in the glittering lobby, Maya looked up at the ceiling, toward the top floor she could not see. Will Mr. Thorne be sad in his big house again? She asked. Sophia just squeezed her hand. Come on, baby. They left just like that. And when Elias Thorne finally emerged from a week of depressive isolation and noticed the new, unfamiliar cleaner who did not know about the crayon box in the nook, it was too late. The agency told him Sophia Mendez had resigned for personal reasons. No forwarding address, no contact. She and her daughter were gone. He stood in the silent, spotless kitchen, and for the first time in his adult life, Elias Thorne felt the true, crushing weight of his wealth. It had built a fortress so perfect, it had imprisoned him alone. And the one person who had seen through the walls had vanished, taking with her the only key he had ever encountered. He would spend the next 25 years trying to find it. The search began quietly, a single-line item in a vast portfolio of expenditures, but it quickly became an obsession that would redefine his legacy and ignite a war within his own empire. At first, Elias used conventional methods. He hired a discreet private investigator, giving him only the names Sofia and Maya Mendez, the old address, and the date they disappeared. The investigator hit a wall within weeks. Sofia had been thorough. She had left no digital footprint, no new lease in her name, no credit applications. She had, it seemed, simply stepped off the grid. The investigator's final report suggested she may have returned to Guatemala, or perhaps moved in with relatives under a different name. For Elias, it was an unacceptable conclusion. The idea that the one person who had spoken a fundamental truth to him could vanish without a trace felt like a personal failure of cosmic proportions. He fired that investigator and hired another, then another. The instructions were always the same: find them, do not make contact, just find them. The expense was irrelevant. Over the years, the search parameters evolved. He had investigators look for a girl named Maya who would be entering her teens, then her late teens, with an aptitude for art or science based on the gifts he'd given. He had them scour scholarship lists, community college registries, public assistance records in states across the country. Each dead end felt like a door slamming in the silent penthouse, but the search was doing something else to him. It was forcing him to look at the world he had insulated himself from, to understand how easy it was for people to fall through the cracks of the very society his wealth helped to shape. The line from a research paper on economic mobility haunted him. The United States is among the least economically mobile countries among advanced economies. He hadn't just lost Maya. The system he benefited from was designed to lose thousands of Mayas every single day. This realization began to warp the mission. Finding Maya was no longer just about personal atonement. It became a diagnostic tool, a way to understand the flaw in the machine. He started redirecting the Thorn Legacy Trust with a furious, focused energy. He overruled the board, dissolving multi-million-dollar partnerships with prestigious universities. Instead, he poured funds into grassroots initiatives, after-school coding clubs in housing projects, microloans for single mothers to start home-based businesses, free STEM kits for Title I elementary schools. The board, led by Charles Whitlock, was apoplectic. This wasn't philanthropy, it was activism. It was messy, hard to measure, and offered no prestige. Charles called it emotional vandalism, but Elias was unmovable. Every grant application, every proposal, was viewed through a single, silent lens. Would this have helped Sofia Mendez keep her home? Would this have given Maya Mendez a clearer path? The conflict came to a head at a board meeting 5 years into the search. Charles presented a slick proposal to fund a new computer science wing at an Ivy League school, a building that would bear the Thorn name. Elias listened, then slid his own one-page proposal across the table. It was a plan to fund mobile computer labs, refurbished buses that would travel to the poorest zip codes in 3 states. "We are not in the business of building monuments to ourselves," Elias said, his voice quiet but cutting through the room. "We are in the business of fixing the problem at the point of failure." Charles stared at him, his face a mask of contempt. "The problem, Elias, is that you are chasing a ghost. You are dismantling a century's worth of strategic giving because a cleaning lady's kid made you feel bad one afternoon. It's embarrassing." The room went silent. Elias did not raise his voice. He simply said, "The meeting is adjourned. The mobile labs are approved. Anyone who disagrees may resign." 3 board members did. The search and the philosophical war it fueled became the twin engines of Elias' life for 2 decades. He became a phantom in the philanthropy world, hated by the old guard, mythologized by the grassroots organizers who suddenly found their projects funded by a mysterious, never-seen benefactor. His public persona was that of an eccentric recluse. The private reality was a man consumed by a single question: what became of her? The break finally came not from a high-priced investigator, but from an algorithm. 18 years into the search, Elias funded a small nonprofit that developed software to match disparate public records, utility bills, library card applications, vaccination records, while strictly protecting anonymity. It was designed to help social workers find at-risk families who moved frequently. He gave them one test case, the old, cold data points for Sofia and Maya Mendez. For years, the software churned, finding nothing. Then, on an ordinary Tuesday morning 23 years after they left, a junior data scientist at the nonprofit saw a weak but persistent match in a Midwestern state. A woman named Sofia Marquez had a daughter named Maya of the correct age. The address history showed a move from the original city at the right time. The clinching detail was a barely legible scan of an old rental application where Sofia had listed her previous employer as Aurora Tower Residential Services. She had kept her first name, changed her last, and gone to ground. Elias received the report. He didn't hire another investigator. He went himself. He flew to the city, a quiet mid-sized town, and for 3 days he simply observed. He saw Sofia older, her hair streaked with gray, leaving a small medical clinic where she worked as a janitor. He saw Maya, now a young woman, exiting a public library, a stack of books in her arms. She was a teacher, a high school biology teacher, according to the school's public website. He sat in his rental car and watched the modest, well-kept house they shared, and he wept. He had found them. They had survived. They had built a life. The relief was tsunami-like, washing away 2 decades of guilt, but it was immediately followed by a new, more terrifying question: what now? He couldn't just knock on the door. The gulf of time, of power, of history was too vast. He returned home, the information a live wire in his hands. He began to study Maya's life from a distance. Her teacher reviews were glowing. Students called her the one who actually sees us. She ran an underfunded after-school robotics club. She had published a few articles in educational journals about equity in science access. She was, in every sense, the person her 5-year-old self might have hoped to become, and she was doing it within the same system of constraints that had burdened her mother. This is where the story could have ended. A lonely man finds his peace in secret observation, but Elias Thorne was done with being a spectator. If Maya's childhood sentence had sent him on a 25-year quest to understand a broken system, her adult life presented him with the blueprint to fix a small part of it. He decided to give her, not money, but agency asterisk. He would funnel resources directly into her sphere of influence, anonymously, in a way she could shape and control. He drafted plans to completely overhaul the Thorne Legacy Trust one final time, transforming it from a foundation into a direct action fund, with a mandate to identify and empower local educators like Maya. The Trust's entire remaining endowment, over $150 million, would be moved. When Charles Whitlock got wind of this, it was no longer a professional disagreement. It was an existential threat. Charles had spent a career managing and taking fees from the Thorne fortune. Turning it into a localized grant-giving machine would render him and the entire board obsolete. He convened an emergency meeting of the remaining loyal board members and the Trust's legal counsel. Their finding was stark. Elias' recent behavior, his fixation on a single individual from his past, could be construed as a diminished capacity to manage the Trust. They drafted a petition to the courts seeking to have Elias declared temporarily unfit to manage his philanthropic affairs, thereby installing Charles as the conservator. It was a brutal, legalistic coup. The court date was set. The papers were served at the penthouse. The battle for the soul of Elias' fortune and for the ability to finally, meaningfully, reach Maya was now a matter of public record. And Maya Marquez, grabbing papers in her quiet house, had no idea the storm that was brewing or that she was standing at the very center of it. The hearing was scheduled for a Thursday at 10 a.m. in a nondescript county courthouse. Elias prepared to defend his sanity, his fortune, and a 25-year promise nobody in the room knew he'd made. Charles Whitlock's legal team had leaked details to the financial press. The story was framed perfectly. Reclusive tech millionaire faces conservatorship bid amid erratic behavior. The narrative of the unstable, eccentric rich man was too tasty for the media to ignore. On the morning of the hearing, a small cluster of reporters gathered on the courthouse steps. Elias arrived alone, dressed in a simple dark suit. He ignored every shouted question. His face was calm, but inside, a cold fury burned. This was the final obstacle between him and the silent amends he needed to make. Inside the sterile courtroom, Charles sat with his lawyers, the picture of concerned stewardship. Elias sat at the opposite table, alone by choice. The judge, a weary-looking woman in her 60s, called the room to order. Charles's lead attorney stood and began painting a portrait of a man unmoored. He cited the sudden, radical shifts in charitable giving, the wasteful spending on unproven grassroots programs, the firing of esteemed board members. He presented emails where Elias had repeatedly overruled financial advice with what he called a higher fiduciary duty to human potential. The attorney's voice dripped with condescension. "Your Honor, Mr. Thorne is no longer capable of distinguishing between sound financial stewardship and personal sentimental projects. He is risking the entire legacy of the Thorne Trust on whims." Then it was Elias' turn. He stood, adjusted his jacket, and faced the judge. He didn't use notes. "Your Honor," he began, his voice clear and steady in the quiet room, "for decades I believed wealth was a scorecard. Then 25 years ago, a 5-year-old girl looked at my life, at the literal tower I lived in, and gave me a 4-word performance review. She said, 'You have a big, lonely house.'" A faint ripple of confusion went through the room. Charles rolled his eyes. "That child," Elias continued, "was the daughter of my cleaner. She saw what billions of dollars, boards of directors, and yes, even my own attorneys could not. She saw the truth. And then, because of the very systemic failures my wealth had insulated me from, she and her mother disappeared into a country where people like them vanish every single day. I spent a quarter of a century trying to find her, not to give her money. To understand how I could use the resources, I had to make sure fewer children have to give that diagnosis to the empty rooms of this nation." He turned and looked directly at Charles. "What my former colleague calls sentimental projects are, in fact, targeted investments in the exact points where our economic mobility engine fails. He calls it erratic. I call it the first rational thing I've ever done with my money." He presented the judge with a simple binder. It contained the before and after metrics of the trust's work, the university building grants versus the mobile lab programs. The numbers for community impact were overwhelmingly in favor of his new direction. "The petition before you isn't about my competence," Elias concluded. "It's about control. It's about a system that prefers tidy, prestigious inaction over messy, effective action." The judge examined the documents. Charles's attorney stood for rebuttal, spluttering about fiduciary norms and the dangers of anecdote-driven philanthropy. But the momentum had shifted. The judge asked pointed questions about the trust's charter, which clearly stated its purpose was to foster innovation and opportunity in education. She noted that Elias' new approach seemed a direct, if unorthodox, interpretation of that mandate. Just as she was about to call for a recess, the back door of the courtroom opened. A woman stepped inside. She was in her early 30s, dressed in a simple blouse and slacks, her dark hair pulled back. She had the calm, observant eyes of a teacher who has seen every kind of student. It was Maya. She had seen the news article online that morning. A colleague had sent it joking, "Hey, isn't this the guy whose penthouse your mom used to clean?" The name Thorne, the mention of a cleaner's daughter, the timeline, it all crashed together in her mind. She had driven 3 hours straight to get here. All eyes turned to her. Charles looked annoyed by the interruption. Elias simply stopped breathing. Time folded. The 5-year-old with the crayon was gone, and in her place stood this poised, unknown woman. Maya's gaze swept the room, past the lawyers, past Charles, and landed on Elias. There was no shock of recognition. She had been too young to remember his face clearly. But she saw a man standing alone at a table, and something in his stance, the intensity of his quiet, resonated with a faint, childhood memory of a tall figure in a big, quiet space. The judge asked who she was. Maya cleared her throat. "My name is Maya Marquez. My mother, Sophia, was a cleaner. She worked for Mr. Thorne 25 years ago. I think I might be the person he's been talking about." The silence in the courtroom was absolute. Elias found his voice, a hoarse whisper. "You brought me a drawing of a sun that was too far away to be warm." Maya's hand went to her mouth. A memory, long buried, surfaced. The cold island, the serious man, her mother's fear. She nodded slowly. I think I did." The judge, perceiving the monumental shift in the room's energy, called an immediate recess. In a small, plain conference room, Elias Thorne and Maya Marquez faced each other for the first time in a quarter of a century. He didn't approach her. He just said, "Your mother, is she well?" Maya nodded. "She is. She's tough." Elias' eyes glistened. "I tried to help. Once, I did it wrong. I am so sorry." Maya listened as this stranger, this millionaire from a past life, haltingly explained the search, the redirected fortune, the legal battle. He showed her photos on his phone of the mobile labs, the community centers, the scholarship funds named not after him, but after concepts like Horizon and Pathfinder. "You said I had a lonely house," he said, his voice thick. "You were right, and you made me want to build a bigger table." Maya, a public school teacher who wrote grant proposals for basic lab supplies, was overwhelmed. The scale was incomprehensible, but the intention was crystal clear. This man had spent decades trying to fix a crack in the world he'd seen through her eyes. She thought of her students, of the broken microscopes and the dreams that sometimes flickered out for lack of fuel. "What happens now?" she asked quietly. What happened was the withdrawal of the petition. Faced with the living, breathing embodiment of Elia's whim, Charles Whitlock had no legal or narrative ground to stand on. The judge dismissed the case with a pointed remark about the importance of purpose in philanthropy. The story, however, was now public. The reunion of the millionaire and the cleaner's daughter became a sensation, but not for the reasons people expected. There was no romance, no sudden inheritance. Instead, Elias invited Maya, and later Sophia, to become advisors to the newly reformed Thorn Legacy Trust, not figureheads, but genuine guides. Maya's first recommendation was simple: stop the mobile labs from just visiting schools, help them stay, fund the permanent repair of school science labs in the poorest districts. Sophia, when she finally met Elias again, was wary. The power imbalance was still a canyon, but she saw her daughter engaged, not patronized. She saw a man who was, finally, listening. She agreed to consult on programs supporting single parents in vocational training. The trust's new headquarters was not in a skyscraper, but in a renovated warehouse in Maya's city. Elias moved his base of operations there. He didn't give them money. He gave them a seat at the table where the money was directed. The final, surprising detail emerged a year later, during the trust's first public report. A journalist asked Maya if she felt her life had been changed by all this. She thought carefully. "A long time ago, I noted that a house was lonely. The change isn't that the house is now full. The change is that the door was finally unlocked, and the tools inside are being handed out to anyone who needs to build something better." The legacy wasn't a fortune left to a stranger. It was a fortune transformed by one. Elias Thorne's obituary, many years later, would not lead with his net worth or his tech innovation. It would lead with a single sentence. He spent the second half of his life ensuring no child would ever have to tell another person they lived in a lonely house. And in the quiet of that fulfilled promise, the story finds its rest and its invitation to us. So what is the weight of a single sentence? In a world measured in data points and net worth, we often forget that the most powerful currency isn't money at all. It's truth, the unvarnished, unafraid kind. The kind a child delivers without knowing its value, because she hasn't yet learned that some truths are too expensive to speak. Elias Thorne's story isn't about a fairy tale inheritance. It's about a diagnosis. A little girl walked into a gilded cage, pointed at the lock from the inside and said, "This is broken." And a man who could buy anything except his own freedom finally listened. The 25-year search, the legal battle, the transformed fortune, all of it was just the long, arduous process of a person trying to become worthy of a truth they'd been given. This story asks us an uncomfortable question. How many of us are living in versions of that lonely house, not made of glass and steel perhaps, but built from business, from status, from the careful curation of a life that looks full but feels hollow? And who around us might be offering the simple, piercing observation that could set us free if we only had the courage to hear it? The cleaner, the cashier, the quiet co-worker, the child who hasn't learned to filter. Wisdom doesn't wear a price tag. It often wears the most humble disguise. We tell stories like this not because they're rare, but because they're possible. They are reminders that the walls we think are permanent might just be waiting for the right few words to dissolve them. That redemption isn't always a grand gesture. Sometimes it's a lifetime spent aligning your resources with a moment of clarity you were gifted long ago. If this story moved you, if it reminded you of a moment when someone's small, honest words changed your perspective, then you understand why we do this. Share that moment in the comments below. Tell us about the sentence that rewired something in you. Let's build a collection of the quiet truths that changed everything. Subscribe to this channel for more documentaries about the unseen connections that rewrite lives. We don't chase the loud headlines here. We sit with the hushed, powerful stories of humanity, the kind that don't make the news, but absolutely make the world. Because sometimes, the most important legacy isn't what you build for yourself. It's what you choose to build after a little girl tells you that your castle is empty. Thank you for listening.